Okay, so I'm recording now. Can you clap your hands for me? I know that sounds weird. Okay. It just says like to start the audio. Okay. Okay, so what is your favorite part about running this shop?
Going home at the end of the day. Only kidding. The favorite part for me these days is actually going out and going to people's homes who've had records that they're looking to part with and finding amazing, unusual things out of the norm that I don't see all the time.
So what got you started with all of this, and what do you love about vinyl?
Well, it started in the early 60s when I was a kid, having records that my mother and father brought home to play, and I started buying them when I had my first money from shoveling sidewalks and doing errands, and then my paper route money, I would spend all of that on records as a kid. And through high school, same thing. Just loved music. The Beatles pretty much dragged me into rock and roll music, and always listening to the radio to hear all the newest songs by all the bands of the day at the time. And then I graduated to long play albums in the later 60s when I could afford a little more than the 45, and started getting turned on through the FM stations like RPI at the time that were playing a lot of underground rock. Started hearing bands that I read about in the papers and magazines from the West Coast and New York City, and I just fell in love with the music, and just was constantly buying records, and my knowledge expanded from buying the stuff, plus also reading on it in magazines and newspapers related to music. And by the mid-late 70s, I got a job at a record store locally, which was the top record store in the area back then, called Just a Song. Worked there. Then I worked for a now defunct used store in Albany called World's Record in the 1980. And then I was in a band, local punk band called the ADs, and we played around for quite a bit, put out a few 45s and an album back in the day. Moved to New York City with the band, started working with Midnight Records in Manhattan, which was a mail order business turned retail. Worked there for a couple of years. The band broke up. I moved back home because I wanted to start my own business, and I really didn't feel I could start it in New York without having the cushion of cheap rent. So I moved back here and started the mail order by buying up records at various other stores and out of town that I knew were collectible, that were being sold cheaper at the time. And expanded the mail order in 1989 to this shop. And here we are 27 years later. In between all that, of course, in the 70s and 80s, I worked construction, framing houses, making pizzas, cooking in restaurants, silk screening shirts, digging trenches for cable TV. I did it, a lot of things in between working in record stores too, and went to college here and there, and here I am.
So what do you find the most meaningful about what you do?
Meaningful. Well, I guess being able to find music that people may or may not be aware of that is interesting. It's pretty easy to get in, Led Zeppelin records and Pink Floyd records and Miles Davis albums, and the ones that everybody's looking for that has a knowledge. But I really it's rewarding to find people digging through these bins and looking at the more obscure artists that they might find interesting. So that's why we have so much here of titles in every category by bands and singers and groups that maybe didn't get their due at the time, and we may have it here to try out at a reasonable price.
All right. So what do you notice about customers who come in here and like the general interest in vinyl? Like, has it changed over the years? What do you think?
Well,
and what do you think people like about vinyl?
Well, I think people like the possession of something again. There seems to be a growing awareness that, you know, it's just nice to own it and have it, as opposed to having 50,000 songs jammed into a little cigarette case. I think they like the artwork. People who have more of a discerning ear will enjoy the sound, the analog sound, as opposed to digital, if they have, especially if they have better equipment to play it on. And I think also it's a big middle finger to corporate music companies who just overcharged on compact discs and went digital, and they kind of just hurt themselves. I mean, if you look into the 90s, when vinyl was supposedly dead in the U.S., it was still quite big overseas, and there was a cult in this country of people who were still buying, mainstream used records, but the punk hardcore scene was very much into still making 45s and albums and not putting out a CD version of their recorded music, as almost anti-establishment. Of course, Pearl Jam, they were very big promoters on putting vinyl out. In fact, they insisted on having vinyl versions of all their releases at the time, as did a number of the other bands out of the Seattle scene, Nirvana, Soundgarden, and then throughout the country, just small patches of people deciding they wanted to put a vinyl version of their release out, which I thought was pretty cool. And then there was a bunch of companies that were reissuing rare 60s and 70s vinyl, like Scorpio out of Pennsylvania. And you could buy the stuff cheap. I really am a little disappointed now, though. It seems to me that the whole vinyl thing has gotten a little corporate again. It seems to me just unfathomable that a new album by a new group, or a reissue of something is trading now for $20 to $30 a piece. And I don't understand that. I understand that the pressing plants are being taxed to the max because a lot of them closed back in the day and the machinery disappeared and there's not parts. But it still seems to me that there's some gouging going on now within the industry, and I think that's going to hurt, because I think there's a lot more vinyl that could be sold if it was more in a equal frame of what the dollar value is, compared to, say, in the 70s, the early 80s, an album was listing for $4, $5, $6.98, and you could pick it up sometimes for $4 to $5 new. I would think, here we are 25 years later, I would think an album that was going for $15 on a standard would be more comparable than what they're doing with that. And I think it hurts, especially young buyers who don't have a lot of money in their pocket. Instead of maybe being able to buy 2 or 3 good new records, they have to buy one and go home. I don't know. I'm a little disappointed in all that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad to see that all this stuff is coming out again. I just think, do you have to have 180, 200 gram vinyl? I mean, most people don't even have the equipment that would make that, usable in the sense of a collectible. If you're playing it on a $100, $200 turntable, what's the point? So I don't know. That's a little bug I have. I go out of town and see record stores that are just loaded with new vinyl. We don't carry a whole lot here because the markup has to be dramatically low from what I pay, so I don't mess with it, because it's not worth it, and it doesn't really, to me, draw in a crowd like my used crowd comes in digging, looking for stuff that is cheaper and isn't been reissued, or is harder to find, or if it is reissued, so a lot of times I've got an original copy cheaper than the reissue is going for. So figure that out. Mm-hmm. But it's just a pet peeve I have, and I think there's going to be a little backlash on this new vinyl stuff.
Yeah. That's
just my opinion.
Is there anything else you want to add, maybe, that I didn't really talk about?
I think it's a fun hobby to get into, and for young people. And a lot of older people are coming back to it who gave up their record collection, and now they're suddenly back involved if they're into music because they're enjoying it. I think there's a lot of music you can find here and other places that hasn't been reissued that you can get cheap enough to fatten up your collection. Not every record's got to be a $30, $40 collectible. There's loads of albums in my store that are $3, $4, $5, $6, $7, $8 that are really good music in the genre they're in and worth owning, especially at that price.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I guess that's it. I mean, I would say to any newbie, you know, you've got so much of this used music floating around now that is cheap. It's a great time to experiment and look for stuff that you've never heard of before in different categories of music, because it's all out there and it's cheap. You can find a lot of good 50s and 60s pop and jazz and soul and folk and country music real cheap, rather than, you know, dropping $40, $50 on one record that, you know, you already know you like. So
Mm-hmm.
and that's my comment for today.
All right.